We begin our look at gentrification with this image of a street corner in Park Slope, Brooklyn in 1980. By 1980, Park Slope, like many of our urban neighborhoods, experienced years of decline, social decline as people left the area for better opportunities, economic decline as cities and states focused more of their investment on the areas surrounding the cities rather than the inner cities themselves. So by the early 80s, streets like this were very common in cities like New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston. The process of gentrification looks at the social and economic transformation of neighborhoods. By 2016, this street corner had transformed, and it became one of the more popular, one of the more desirable blocks in an expensive neighborhood. Today, the average rent for a two-bedroom, two-bath apartment in Park Slope is going to start around $4,000. So we really see a light and day transformation from 1980 to what we find today in this block. So in the following lecture, we're going to dig into gentrification, answer what is it, where does it happen, who's involved, why does it happen, and what are some of the results. When we ask ourselves to define gentrification, we look back to 1960 and the work done by a social scientist named Ruth Glass. And Ruth Glass was working in England, and she started to recognize that some of the older, run-down communities in the cities were starting to get this revitalization, this transformation. When we talk about gentrification, it's important to recognize that we're discussing both the physical and social transformation of a neighborhood. We need both of these to occur. In many communities, we see upgrading, we see improvement, but with gentrification, we're talking about a physical and social transformation. So as the community improves, we're also looking at a group from the outside coming in and displacing the existing group. Gentrification follows a period of decline. So earlier we looked at ideas like redlining, where investment was cut off from certain communities. Other urban communities, through the process of deindustrialization and decentralization, saw their populations go to the suburbs and the surrounding areas. So following extended periods of decline, certain parts of our cities are prime for gentrification. The term gentry, really the key to gentrification, comes from the idea of a land-owning aristocrat. So when we look at gentrification, we're looking at a higher class coming from the outside, moving into our community and driving these upgrades. The existing lower class residents are usually displaced, and displacement comes in a number of ways. One is economic, so as the neighborhood becomes more popular, it becomes more expensive. We also see social displacement. So as these changes are happening in the community, the longtime residents no longer recognize their neighbors, their businesses, the sense of place that they've come to identify as their community. When we look at where gentrification takes place, we could sum it up in this quintessential gentrifying neighborhood. Not all neighborhoods gentrify, so that's why when we go through our cities today, certain areas have been revitalized, certain areas have long been stable, certain areas have long been working class or rich or middle class. So not all neighborhoods are going to go through gentrification. Normally, we see some characteristics with our gentrifying neighborhoods. One, they're usually small, at least in the beginning, and the importance or the attractiveness of that space is usually more prominent than the physical size. So when neighborhoods start to gentrify, especially in the early years, it usually takes place in a few square blocks. It's not a massive swath of the city that all of a sudden gentrifies. These areas are usually within a mile of the central business district, the main downtown area of employment. What's attractive in this sense is that individuals could walk, or they could bike, or they could use transit to get from home to work. So that proximity to a major job center is key. We also look at locational attributes. Is this located on a park? Parks usually attract people. They hold their value better. Is it on the waterfront? Is it historic? Is it an area of unique architecture? These are the types of attributes that we see draw people in. We also see that these areas are found in locations of former industry. So former mill buildings, back when we used to engage in heavy industry as a country. A lot of these areas are found in really prime locations within a city. And since we no longer use these mills for heavy industry, we convert them into places of what we call consumption, where we could live a new modern lifestyle. The idea of walkability again is key. So we see our buildings are designed as mixed use structures. So at the bottom we have retail, we have stores, we have shops, we have businesses, we have restaurants, we have bars, and upstairs we have living spaces. As the area gentrifies, engages in this process, we see what are called amenity bundles grow and start to transform the cultural landscape. So some of the former businesses may open up as new trendy restaurants, cafes. You might see a gym. You might see new grocery stores replace old ones. So where it occurs is often driven by proximity to downtown and also along a waterfront or a park or an area of historical significance. When we look at our gentrifiers themselves, they most often fall into a category called DINKs, dual income young professionals. These individuals are often couples, maybe recently married, living together. They generally don't have kids. So within a gentrifying area, one of the last transformations to occur is the improvement in local schools. We see the gentrifiers coming in. They usually have higher educations, higher salaries than existing residents, and they also work in new economy jobs. So we have individuals in the tertiary and quaternary sectors, where the existing residents may be secondary sector, maybe semi-skilled tertiary sector activities. Gentrifiers are often singles. Again, we don't see a lot of families moving into these areas, and oftentimes gentrifiers will start families in a gentrifying community and then move somewhere else to raise their kids. Again, another reason why we don't see a big growth in schools or an improvement in local schools. Oftentimes we'll see small private schools open up, or we'll see Montessori schools or charter schools start, but really schools and education is a lagging part of this gentrifying process. Historically, most of our gentrifiers are white. We've seen here in the last decade or so that trend is slowing a little bit, and our gentrifiers are more diverse now than before. There's still majority white, but we see a growth in African American, a growth in Hispanic, a growth in Asian gentrifiers. And when we look at this gentrifying process, we often find early diversity. So the first year or two of gentrification, we see our new outside group coming in. Oftentimes we see a racial and ethnic mixture. That's what's important about this process, is as we recognize gentrification going on, that there are ways to retain that diversity so that it doesn't go from racially and economically homogeneous on one end to racially and ethnically and economically homogeneous on the other end. So cities are trying to figure out a way, incentives to keep that mix of backgrounds, of occupations, of income, so that we're not just pushing out a group that was there that made that place interesting and replacing it with a new group, that we're actually able to preserve that sense of place for long-time residents and also make that place attractive for others. When we look at how gentrification takes hold, this idea of sweat equity is what we find early on. And sweat equity is the actual physical rehabilitation of properties by the owner. So somebody might buy a house and work on it with the team and personally fix the property up. So early on, it takes we're often referred to as pioneers, moving into a community and starting this transition. As the area becomes more trendy and attractive, we see the growth of new, modern, trendy businesses. Again, that idea of amenity bundles, where we have recreation, gym, shopping, nightlife, higher-end stores, really serving that higher income, walkable community. As the neighborhood becomes more and more attractive, we see that local governments will often offer tax incentives to keep people there, to attract more people in. As the neighborhood becomes more expensive, the tax base grows and the ability to fund services increase. So the financial markets and also local governments are more attuned to keeping that place prosperous. The transformation usually takes about 2 years. from start to finish. Now that could be faster or slower depending on how hot the market is, but you're usually looking at about a 2-year transformation. And then what happens is interesting. We often see that, again, our gentrifying neighborhoods are usually small at first, so neighborhoods adjacent to that gentrifying space may begin to transform. Or if a neighborhood becomes really popular, we actually see the early gentrifiers later displaced by a new wave of gentrifiers. So it's a really interesting, exciting theme in urban geography because it's something we're living through now in a lot of our cities. Baltimore has experienced, our local city has experienced a tremendous amount of gentrification in different neighborhoods at different times over the last 20 years. The results of gentrification are mixed, and this is where research and understanding and examining the process is really key. The pros and cons of the gentrification often relies on who you are. If you're an outside person coming in and you invest early in the neighborhood as a gentrifier, you could reap really social and economic benefits. But if you're a longtime resident and your family has been there for generations, you could lose your sense of place. You could be socially and economically pushed out of your community. So the results of gentrification, again, are mixed. Generally, we see economic growth and an increased tax base, better funding services, improving quality of life, but oftentimes that comes for newcomers where the longtime residents are displaced and pushed elsewhere. So it is a mixed bag, and it's important that we look at gentrification critically. And again, one of the keys to gentrification is maintaining that integration and excitement of the early years so that we don't just lose a community that has been there, where families and people know each other, business owners are local. We don't want to see that lost as communities to chains, to outside financiers, to people who are only going to live there for a year or two before moving on to another phase in life. So gentrification, it's exciting, it's economically positive, but socially there are concerns with the process. Again, our neighborhood in Park Slope, Brooklyn, an area that was unwanted and now is one of the most expensive communities in New York City. This was a plan for Baltimore City's waterfront in the 1960s. You can see here, this would be for those of you who are familiar with the area, this was Interstate 70 coming from west to east. This is Interstate 83, and then 83 would extend down here to 95. Many of you have probably taken 83 to the end and hit a series of stoplights. Some of you coming from the west have probably run into Interstate 695, and then 70 goes a little bit farther into the city where it just ends. So those odd end points for 83 and 70 reflect a history of interstates that were supposed to connect. The waterfront was not seen as a nice place during this period as investment went outside the city. Deindustrialization, so factories were shutting down. Suburbanization was attracting people outside. Highways were being built around the city so people could go around or through the city, but not to it. Fortunately, the communities along the waterfront were able to stop this from happening, and as a result, this part of Baltimore is one of the most attractive places, the most economically prosperous places in the city, as these residents here are home to many affluent residents. This is the Ritz-Carlton. This part of the city was a former paint plant, a former shipyard, and it's transformed both socially and physically into a place of high-end consumption. A little bit east is the Canton neighborhood, and Canton was a place of canning and rail yards. Today, it's another upper middle class gentrified neighborhood. Harbor East, just outside of Little Italy, a former rail yard. The palimpsest of the old rail station is there, but this area has totally transformed through private investment. The neighborhood in Highland Park is in the midst of gentrification, and one of the residents there is trying to capture the essence of Highland Park, where we're seeing a mix of a longtime community and newcomers coming in, where the businesses are owned by generations of the same families, while the newcomers are the new patrons, where we see food trucks mixed with Korean churches. Starbucks mixed with dollar stores. So the Highland Park experiment that's ongoing is a look at hopefully what we can retain in many of these gentrified places, the economic prosperity and excitement without loss of place.